Hello everyone, and welcome back to a rainy Live at 5. I am your host, Kevin Adkisson, the curator with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. And today we are going to be on the very sort of top corner, I guess the southeasterly most corner of what we sometimes call the homestead property. Which is very near Cranbrook House, sort of between Cranbrook House and Brookside School. So just to sort of orient us, behind me is what should be called the mall, which was a long landscaped lawn of different specimen trees enjoyed by the booths. Today it is overflow parking for Brookside School Cranbrook. And sort of up above me, if I flip my camera around, we can see the twin cottages designed by Marcus Burroughs, who was trained in the architecture office of Albert Kahn. You can see that Gretchen, the head of the Academy's architecture department, has a fire going in the fireplace where she lives. Cranbrook House is right behind those trees. But for our purposes, we are going to be talking about this little waterway here as I try not to submerge myself. And this is the old mill race. And it leads down to the old Morris Mill. I don't know if any of you have ever come and enjoyed this particular corner of Cranbrook's campus. But this waterway here is, in one form or another, one of the very oldest things at Cranbrook on the property. I will head back up. It was not supposed to start to rain until a little bit later this evening, but it clearly has begun. So long ago, long before there were any white settlers here in this area, this piece of property, which is right off of the old Sauk Trail, what became the Saginaw Trail, and then Woodward Avenue, was a place where there were three different tribes of the Anishinaabe tribes, the Ojibwa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. And so we now know them as the Saginaw Chippewa tribes. And they use this land for seasonal hunting, so there may have been seasonal villages here in the summer or in the winter. The men may have been hunting here, but there was no sort of permanent settlement on this piece of land. And so that changed in 1819 when Mr. William Morris came and he purchased the piece of property that forms the largest basis of Cranbrook. And George Booth always got a kick out of saying that he bought his land from William Morris, referencing the English arts and crafts founder and the great artist William Morris. But our William Morris was unrelated to the English William Morris. In fact, he was Oakland County's first sheriff. He ran a general store. He ran a ashery, a tannery. He ran a brick and tile manufactory that was actually where Kingswood is today. And then he also ran the W&B grist mill. And the B in W&B was for Amasa Bagley, who was an Oakland County judge. And together they ran the grist mill right here at the end of the mill race. Now, in their own times, the mill race was just a sort of glorified gulch. It was not as wide as it is today. And the mill that I am showing you is, in fact, a very romantic 20th century reconstruction. We do have, as part of the Cranbrook collection, a pencil drawing of the original mill. And it was where flour and corn would have been, or where wheat would have been grist into flour. And that mill, it was actually at this moment in the roadway at Cranbrook Road in Lone Pine, where Lone Pine had to do a number of switchbacks to deal with this hill that is behind me. And so the mill was sort of on the edge of this hill. The road had to do a switchback. There was a mill pond behind the mill. And then the most interesting thing I learned about this whole enterprise of Mr. Morris was that he was actually, as the county sheriff, responsible for all of the orphans, all of the elderly, and all of the disabled people of Oakland County. And so he housed them here on the Cranbrook property, and then he employed them working at his various businesses. And this sort of operation was, I think, very successful for Mr. Morris. But as time went on, the Mr. Morris's and Bagley's mill became less successful. It was taken over in the 1860s by Samuel and Kezia Alexander. And Mr. Alexander had studied at the State Agricultural College. He had served in the Civil War, but he was a bit of a local eccentric. He was a terrible farmer, and he planted a bunch of orchards that never really produced fruit, the same orchards that Mrs. Booth complained she couldn't get enough apples for an apple pie out of. And so he didn't make his money as a farmer, but instead he was making his money selling materials to the mill and sort of helping in the mill operations. He was known to go barefoot even in winter, which reminds me of many of our academy students. And so in 1884, there were fireworks on 4th of July, and those burned down the Alexander's house. And then a little bit later in 1889, the original grist mill burnt down. Fast forward to 1904, George and Ellen Booth buy this piece of property, and the family sort of gets great joys in the earliest days of owning the Cranbrook estate, of sort of walking around and discovering what they could in this old farmland, in these hills. And so they sort of went throughout the property and they began naming things. And so they called this hill here, this became Morris Point, also known as Flagstaff Point. And then down below was the Evergreen Grove. And around 1906, they discovered the ruins of the old grist mill. And it still had a lot of its sort of iron material there. And so the Booths, ever being responsible with their finances and resources, took all of the old iron and scrapped it, and using that money in 1906, they expanded the mill race into the canoe pond that we looked at earlier. And so they still called it the mill race, but it was expanded and adapted into this much wider place where they could ride their canoes up and down. And then in 1916, Mr. and Mrs. Booth decided that they would reconstruct the mill as this sort of arts and crafts project. And so they built this little brick structure with the blue tiles. And then there is this 16-foot water wheel here. And so the water wheel, which is kept off, powered the pumping station to actually get water onto campus. And so if you know the Sunset Cascades by the Greek Theater, the Sunset Cascades as well as the pool at the Greek Theater were all connected, or they were all powered by this little pump station. So they still call this building Morris Mill, but in fact it turned into a sort of romantic water wheel on the side and then a modern pump house inside in order to get more water up onto the estate. And then of course this is Cranbrook Road directly in front of me with the old meeting house here. And then Brookside School coming off of the meeting house in all of its additions from 1918 to 1922 to 1925 to 1939 down there, all the way up to 1996 at the very end. So just so you know where we are, here we see Brookside. Now, what I find fascinating about this little mill here is that in 1921, George Booth, as a gift to his father, who was by that point quite elderly, Henry Wood Booth, George Booth decided to build within the little mill here a copper shop. And so you may know that the Booths in Cranbrook, Kent County, England, the Booths from which our founding family were descended, they were all coppersmiths. And so George Booth Sr. was a coppersmith, Henry Wood Booth was a coppersmith, our George Booth was an ironworker, and still involved in the metals industry. But in 1921, George Booth decided to outfit for his very elderly father a new little copper shop within this building. And Henry Wood Booth would write in his diaries, which he was quite dedicated to. Henry Wood Booth wrote about thinking that he was going to be able to just sort of pick up immediately where he left off as a coppersmith, but that he had actually sort of forgotten how to do everything. He couldn't find the right tools. Walter Nichols, who was our blacksmith, who did many of our gates, he helped the elderly Mr. Booth and helped fashion more tools. And he did begin to do an output of little bowls and other sort of copper cups and things out of the old Morris Mill site. Now, another feature of this corner, and now we get a better idea of Morris Hill, though I don't know of anyone who has a name for this hill. So if you start using the name, make sure you use Morris Hill, but I've never heard it referred to that. There's also this road that runs alongside of it. And this road is actually the original Cranbrook Road. So it was here long before George and Ellen Booth, and it helped connect all of the farming neighborhoods. At one point, George Booth decides that he, in fact, did not want to have this city right away. And so he signed the deal to move the city street from one side of the mill race to the other side of the mill race, and accordingly built a stone wall so that people would not try to keep using his the former road that's now private property. And so Cranbrook Road was moved on the other side of the right-of-way. Now, this little mill, which I have never been inside of, continued to have the water wheel spinning, and I don't know what happened to the copper shop inside of it, but around World War II, the water wheel was spraying so much water, it was causing ice to build up and cars to sort of skid through Cranbrook Road. It was restored in the early 1970s. It was restored again in 1988 and had more work done in 2001. But today, I don't know if we ever turn the water wheel on. This whole sort of diversion up here that looks quite well protected with all the chain link fence, that this is how one would die. And then the water, that is the way the water takes most days. And then down here is where we would restore the water wheel and connect it. So it's still, I believe that all of this dates to the 1987 renovation, just looking at it, but I'm not really sure, and I did not go into archives to study the plan. So we've seen the old Morris Mill site, we've learned about Henry Wood Booth. Next, I want to go up to another little corner of campus here, and this is like the most in the weeds live at 5 I think we may have done. Literally in the weeds, but also this is just not exactly a side of campus that people often come to. Unless you are a Brookside student, because there is a tunnel from Brookside onto the Morris Mill site. So the students can actually come, and then they emerge here onto Morris Hill, our Flagstaff Hill. And we can see Christ Church Cranbrook popping out in all of its glory there. Some modern steps that have recently been reconstructed. And at the top of the hill, we get to our next subject of today's talk, the mysterious Altar of Atonement, or the Altar of Atonement. And this is much more modern than the Morris Mill site, or the sort of 19th century history of the site. This dates to 1954. And we can see here the dedication, May 16th, 1954. And then here it says, worship in a tent. And then on the other side, May 15th, 1904. And then the last side, thanks be to God. And this altar was placed here by the Cranbrook Architectural Office, who designed it along with Henry Scripps Booth, on May 16th, 1954. And it commemorates the first Sunday school lesson of Henry Wood Booth on this property. So when the Booths bought this property in 1904, there would have been churches in Birmingham, but there was really nothing out here for the farmers. And so Henry Wood Booth must have gone kind of door to door to all the farming families, because on May 15th, 1904, he gathered here and he taught a Sunday school lesson to 17 people. And they were the family's children, but also the domestics, the domestic staff that came with the family when they would come up to picnic here on the estate. And then it was also the neighbors, and a few people from Detroit also came up for the first Sunday school lesson. Lessons continued here on this corner from 1904 until they moved into the meeting house in 1918. And so for 14 years, Henry Wood Booth would teach Sunday school in both summer and winter in a tent. George Booth ordered him 24 chairs in May, late May of 1904, and he quickly filled up those chairs, and they had to get more chairs. I don't know if they ever got a bigger tent. It was a very simple tent operation up here. But he really became the sort of de facto spiritual teacher of the community here with his Sunday school lessons for adults and children. And in his letters, especially between him and his dear wife, Clara, he talks about how, oh, that farmer, they have lots of children. I'll go down and see if I can get them to come to our Sunday school. And he also advertised that he would start at 3 o'clock earlier than the service to help teach the children how to sing, because as he told Clara, they really had terrible singing voices. And so they would come here before the Sunday school lesson and they would rehearse the hymns. Now, in 1918, Henry Wood Booth's lessons moved down the hill into the meeting house that's now a part of the Brookside construction, so you can just see the meeting house there. And in 1921, he did stop teaching lessons because he felt the attendance was low. He thought he was getting too old for the whole operation. That's around the same time that he started the copper shop up. And of course, Doctors Reverend Marquis would come and establish Christ Church Cranbrook. He would be invited in October of 1924 and then arrive with his wife in April of 1925. The church would open a few years after that. And so it is interesting to me that Cranbrook's religious history, first, it is the very first thing here, before there were farms, before the family moved here in 1908, before there were schools, or artists, or the museums, there was church service. And so it started here in 1904. It moved across the street once to the meeting house, and then across the street again to Christ Church Cranbrook. So religion has always sort of been right here around the Morris Mill site. The actual altar itself was dedicated on Sunday morning at 10:30 in the morning on May 16th, 1954. It's made up of a 5-inch thick piece of limestone on a 4-foot radius within the words inscribed around. The two sort of shallow cardinal directions here are pointing north, south, east, and west, and they form the shape of a cross. And Henry Booth wrote about feeling that this cross was a moment for us to sort of center ourselves. And so he called it the Altar of Atonement, but he also pronounced it and would describe it as the Altar of Atonement. And he wanted people, as they wandered through the grounds of Cranbrook, to pause here and think about sort of the oneness of all of God's creatures and the sort of shared humanity that we all can find. When it was dedicated, they had a procession from Christ Church Cranbrook here. Henry Booth loved flags. He loved ceremonies. He called them moments to make memories. And so if you could have a banner at an occasion, he would have a banner, which I fully support. And then the church's cross is meant to go in here. And so the procession was led by the altar acolytes, who then placed the cross in the center of the altar. And then they had the service around the altar. It is interesting looking back to the photos of 1954. There's all grass on this hill. So the altar is really just sort of up above Lone Pine Road, and it's just a grassy knoll with the altar. And so they actually could get the entirety of Christ Church Cranbrook around the altar. It was a very different time. Heads of all the Cranbrook institutions were also there. And so all 6 of the institutions were represented. All 6 marched into the ceremony, the dedication ceremony, behind their flags, which were, of course, designed by Henry Booth in the 30s and again in the 50s. And then after the service here at 10:30, at 11 o'clock or 11:15, they went over to Christ Church, where Dr. Hoey, the headmaster of the boys' school, delivered a sermon on the occasion of Founders Day. Then at 1 o'clock, they went down to the boys' school and they had a luncheon in the boys' dining room. At 2:15, they dedicated the Keppel Gymnasium. It was built in 1931, but it was renamed the Charles Keppel Gymnasium after the first assistant headmaster. On the same day, the altar was dedicated. And then from 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock, they had the Founders Day tea at Cranbrook House, where they invited all of the Booth family members, all of the people involved in the sort of leadership of Cranbrook, as well as all of the graduating students of Brookside, Cranbrook School, Kingswood School, and the Art Academy together, which I don't think we do any events similar to Founders Day anymore, sadly. And we certainly don't do any events where we have the elementary school kids all the way up to the graduate students together. So I certainly wish I could have been at that Founders Day. Maybe we'll have them back one day. And then the altar was dedicated. Now, it did fall into disuse, and lucky for us, Henry Booth's writings are extensive, and he never lets his opinion not be known, which I really appreciate. And I so appreciate how much of it survives in Cranbrook archives. And so by the early 80s, he lamented that Christ Church Cranbrook did not ever come over here for services, and they seemed to be ignoring the altar. And he even wrote to one of the new rectors in the 80s, and he said, "I believe the director of the Art Academy is nominally Episcopalian. At least he shows up on Sunday when his mother's in town." And so Henry Booth thought that might be a moment to get the Art Academy to do some more banners to march over to the Altar of Atonement. Now I think when people find this in the woods, they think that Aslan was here, because it does have very sort of Chronicles of Narnia proportion, this great stone altar in the middle of the woods. Now, I was thinking about the altar. It was a suggestion of one of my colleagues, and I'm grateful to Laura McNewman at Archives and Leslie Mayo at the Center for helping me research and prepare for today's Live at 5. But I was also shocked the other day when Christ Church Cranbrook, I saw underneath its tent where it's holding outdoor services, was using the Altar of Atonement. And so the church has commissioned a new reproduction of the Altar of Atonement. And so Obie Birch, who is a scenic designer, created it. He's married to Kathy Brooks, the church accountant. And so Nathan Costa did a little blog post about how the Christ Church Cranbrook is again using a reproduced Altar of Atonement for its new tent services. And I do think there is this sort of wonderful parallel 116 years later for a church that began in a tent on this hill. It has now emerged again on a tent on its lawn using the Altar of Atonement. So I don't know if anyone has any questions. I'm happy to answer them. I have emerged at the very top of Morris Hill, which you can see are now the Brookside School play areas, with some gardens back there, raised planting beds for Cranbrook House and Gardens for some of their back-of-house activities, and then more of the playing fields and Tower Cottage, which is part of the original Cranbrook House 1908 construction by Albert Kahn. If no one has any other questions, do send in where you would like to head next week for Live at 5. And I'm always looking for suggestions. I do know we want to get into the church, and I know we want to get into Kingswood School. Both of those are top of my list as well, and it's just a matter of safety and access, and then we'll be there. Henry Booth was not an ordained minister. He studied architecture with Eliel Saarinen at Michigan, but he was dedicated to the Episcopal Church of America, and he served on every committee at Christ Church Cranbrook, along with his wife Carolyn Farr, who helped establish many of the traditions like Passion of the Gifts at Christ Church Cranbrook. But he was also involved in the larger Michigan Episcopal community, but just as a lay person. So I thought that I would end our little Live at 5 tour here today with some of the words that Henry Booth shared on the morning of the dedication in 1954, when he welcomed the crowd by saying, "We've not come to celebrate the anniversary of a great historical event, except in so far as we recognize the importance of small beginnings in things which have great possibilities from the start." He went on to talk about how the people who gathered that first morning in 1904 could probably never imagine a world where they weren't sitting among crops and farmers, and where there would now be thousands of people in a magnificent church alongside them. But that, and this is Henry again, faith to do what seemed good without worrying about the distant future. We are, if we take one step at a time, taking the long view when we can, but concerning ourselves not too much with the eventual outcome. And it's this sort of idea that the seed will germinate and grow into something much larger than you can imagine. And it is hard to imagine that when Henry Wood Booth said, "I'm going to start teaching Sunday school to a bunch of farmers in the middle of the countryside," that 50 years later he would be, this little corner would be surrounded by educational institutions and museums and Episcopal church, and then I guess 116 years later that it would still be thriving here. And that is the sort of miracle of the Cranbrook idea, that these little moves, these little sort of occasions of celebration and these little actions have snowballed and been nurtured and been guided into this magnificent modern place of art, science, education, and of course still worship. Those of you who know Cranbrook history know that the Christ Church Cranbrook is no longer part of the Cranbrook educational community, which is what I work for. So since 1973, the church and the rest of the community have been two separate legal entities. But we cannot divide the history, we can't divide the story, because they are all so linked together. And of course, the church's archives are part of Cranbrook Archives, which is part of the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research, which is the organization that you are watching today with me. So thanks for watching along. Again, I'm Kevin Adkisson with the Center for Collections and Research. I'll be back next Wednesday. Hopefully there won't be any last-minute surprise rain showers, and I will see you then. If you are on Instagram, I'll be live at 5 on Tuesday on Instagram, and there is another Uncovering Cranbrook lecture coming up on October 27th. I'll be talking about Eero Saarinen and his studies at and designs for Yale, and that's going to be the best lecture I've ever given, so make sure you sign up for that soon on center.cranbrook.edu. Thanks for following along. If you have other questions, send them in the comments. I will go ahead and when I get home post Henry Booth's whole dedication remarks here. It's just 2 pages, but I think it is actually a really nice speech. And so I think this idea of a place on the campus, a quiet sort of corner of campus where one can come and think about atonement and also being at one with everyone, is certainly something that we could need now. So next time you're on campus and you're wandering through the woods, if you stumble upon it, pause, take a moment, reflect, meditate, pray, do whatever makes you comfortable, but think about the sort of history of Cranbrook and the something bigger than ourselves, and think of being at one in the moment. See you later, everyone.